Hi, I'm Maren Leed, the Executive Director of the National Spectrum Consortium, and this is the first in a series of fireside chats that we hope to have with thought leaders and people who are very active in the areas that are of greatest interest to the members of the National Spectrum Consortium. And I am thrilled to kick this series off with my friend and former colleague, real shining light in so much of the technology and policy that is at the center of what the National Spectrum Consortium does. Jim Lewis, he's the Senior Vice President and Director of the Strategic Technologies Program at the Center for Strategic and International Studies. So Jim, it's just a thrill to have you here today. Thanks so much for joining me.
Oh, thank you for having me on the show, Maren. It's great. And it's good to see you too. Yeah.
It's great to see you too. I wish it was in person, but someday soon, we hope. So as I said, you're kind of right in the middle of everything that the NSC is focused on, from innovation to cybersecurity to competitive technologies to collaborating internationally on technical issues. So I think this will be a really rich conversation, and I want to dive right into it, and hopefully we'll just see where it takes us. So you've done so much work throughout your career on cybersecurity, and I think you recently launched something at CSIS around cyber diplomacy, a podcast, I think, if that's correct. And one of your recent episodes talked about cyber diplomacy, international cyber diplomacy. So could you just give me a take of where you see national and international cyber policy going, and what are kind of the big challenges that remain out there in this ever important and increasingly important policy area?
Yeah, I'd say increasingly important. So if you measure it by how many people can spell cybersecurity, we're at a factor of 10.
Moore's Law, does Moore's Law hold, or?
Yeah, so far. So the internet does have borders. I mean, we want to dispel that, but it also, the traffic moves at the speed of light. So the borders are difficult to enforce. And I used to kid people that I was actually closer to Beijing online than I was to the building across the street, 10 milliseconds. So this is a problem where you need countries to cooperate. Ideally, that's not going to happen, but also to work with each other. And that's where the international part comes in. You can divide the world into three parts. There's the like-minded in NATO and Japan and Australia. They largely have come to the same conclusion, which I'll talk about in a second. You have the opponents, Russia, China, Iran, North Korea, very active, and not at all interested in slowing down. And then you have the rest of the world who sort of is on the sidelines, but their opinion is important. So both sides, the like-minded and the bad guys, are fighting over global opinion. The dilemma we have now, and this is the prompt for the series, is when President Biden did the summit with President Putin, a lot of people said, well, this is time for a treaty with the Russians. A great idea, which is why the Russians had it in 1998. And the US has opposed the idea of a treaty with Russia for the last 23 years. Because we already have 3 agreements with them, right, on cyber. For example, you will not allow your territory to be used by criminals. And if you're asked for assistance in dealing with those criminals, you will help out. Well, they agreed to that in 2015. I hope you're not holding your breath. So, the issue for the like-minded now, and I think for parts of the rest of the world, are, okay, we have agreement on norms. We have a framework for responsible state behavior. Global agreement endorsed by every UN member state. People don't pay any attention to it. How do we get some accountability?
So on the technical front, how do you see the impact of this relatively loose or ineffective international structure impacting decisions on US technology way ahead?
I think that the executive order, which was written in response to solar winds, tackles a lot of them and tackles one of the big problems. It starts out by saying, there's some basic things that we should all be doing, like multi-factor authentication, encrypting data at rest, stuff we have been talking about for more than a decade, right? So maybe it'd be nice to actually do it. That's a good first step. Second thing is the harder one, and I give them some credit for tackling this, making software more secure. And this kind of builds on CMMC, the defense initiative, but it goes much further. It's designed to use federal acquisition regulations to drive companies that sell to the federal government to meet certain standards in developing software. And it's a bit shocking. I was talking to one of the analysts, government analysts, who looked at solar winds, and he said he found programming errors that he'd learned to avoid in college, right? So we just have very porous software. And if the executive order succeeds in getting people to write better software, it's going to make life harder for our opponents. Doesn't mean the end, but it will make life harder for them.
Well, to follow on with the intersection of another big focus of yours and of ours, 5G and the implementation of 5G technology. We're very active in the DoD pilot programs, and we have a number of projects associated with that, and just have an open now response for project proposals related to core security for Joint Base San Antonio. So how do you see that intersection playing out? And again, what are some of the important technical things to keep in mind there?
There's a growing realization that 5G is not telecom. It's not phones, right? It's and so I like to think of it as really the next generation of internet connectivity. It will be networks that connect devices and machines and airplanes and factories, and it's the whole, and it's really a new set of protocols that are beneath the IP protocols that we all use, IPv6 or IPv4, which people still use. It's a new layer of technology and connectivity and networks. And that's where it's really interesting, because you have some real opportunities here. And the things people talk about are the integration with the cloud. And the cloud, if it's done right, can improve security. Greater use of AI. And we haven't gone very far down the path of figuring out how to use AI to improve security, but people know about it. Edge processing, where you're going to do computing at the edge. I had one of the big vendors tell me, don't worry about Huawei, because if we move to edge computing, I can handle all your cybersecurity problems out there. Now, it was a little bit of a sales pitch, sure, but the architecture of the network has changed because you have cloud and you have edge in a way that you didn't have before. And doing computing at the edge, necessary for speed, but it also gives you a possibility for security.
Well, you put out a report on 5G sort of way ahead and some of the key issues that need to be addressed. And one of them called for accelerating the repurposing of spectrum, which again is sort of right at is the foundational motivation for the creation of the NSC in the first place, and an area where we remain active and hopefully will be with some of the upcoming auctions. So as the Defense Department, obviously as a major stakeholder in that conversation, tries to wrestle with repurposing spectrum and adapting to a more congested and constrained spectrum environment, what do you think's gone well there? Where is there need for continued improvement? What do you hear people in the administration and on the Hill talk about? What's that space look like in your mind?
I'm sure it's no surprise to your members when I say spectrum is a mess, but people are moving in the direction of the guiding principles are really competition with China. And the good news is that, I just recently saw a chairman of a defense committee announced that the US was losing the 5G race with China. We're not losing the race. It depends what you count. Yeah, the Chinese have more base stations and handsets than us, but that's because they have more people. They have more shoes than us too. So you could say we're losing the shoe race. We're not losing. We're actually doing pretty well. The tricky part, and the standard thing is to divide 5G spectrum, high, medium, and low. We've done great on high. We've done great on low. Medium is the place that's a contest, and you have different values there. You have important national security applications, but you also have important commercial implications. And I think what the report argues is, look, the nature of national security has changed, and we need to update how we think about it. That maybe having technological leadership is as important as having some of the systems and sensors that hang off that spectrum. The other thing, I forgot if it was in the report or not, but I know we talked about it, is we've done this in the past, move spectrum to commercial uses, compensate DoD. I think that's what people are talking about. And then that's where your work becomes important, because if we can find new technologies that let us make better use of spectrum, or that allow us to achieve the same results without using the same spectrum, there's real opportunities there where the advances for DoD can also have commercial benefit. So I think the focus is, how do we, it'll be bumpy. How do we safely move to a more competitive position that balances national security and economics in the mid-band spectrum?
Well, and to that end, it seems to me that one of the core issues there is one that holds for AI as well, which is if part of the solution is shared spectrum, not just relocation, how do you develop the requisite trust on both the government side and the commercial side that they can maintain the levels of service in shared spectrum that both require, right? And it seems like that trust issue is really at the crux of getting some of the technologies adopted and really put to use in a broader and more robust way that is required if we're really going to move meaningfully into this area.
Well,
one of the other things your report pointed out, a couple of things I wanted to talk to. One was the need not just for Congress to authorize money in this space, but to appropriate it as well, and to increase the overall amount of investment to include in many of the things that we attempt to tackle. And what's your take on? There's all kind. There's on the one hand a sort of a very high appetite for spending money these days, and on the other, a growing a recap back to some of the concerns about the deficit and needing to be more restrained. So that part, what was the response to that aspect of your report? What's your prognosis for the likelihood of anybody listening to your very wise words there?
And I should point out, it was a group. And of course, as you know, it's really nice to authorize spending, but that actually isn't signing the check. So people and things have changed. So a year ago, about a year ago, we had an event at CSIS with Senators Cornyn and Warner, where they have the CHIPS Act. And at that point, it was a very nice act, like it a lot, but no money, right? So it's like, I can write acts too, and if there's no money, they don't have any effect. It's changed in a year. It's changed on the Hill. It's changed in the administration. And I think a lot of it is China. My standard joke is that Xi Jinping pulled the trigger too early. If he kept his head down for a little longer, we would have remained asleep. But he's come out, he's decided it's China's moment to win, right? And he says that, at least in Chinese. And people have realized the Chinese aren't shy about spending money. They have a much bigger debt than us, but that's because they're gambling that they're going to win. right? So you want to compete with China, you're going to have to spend money. And I think that message is sinking through. You know, the fighting now is over how much, not over whether. Whereas a year ago, people didn't want to, it's like, we don't want to appropriate, right? And that's not the issue anymore. The issue is how much and other places you can trim. I mean, frankly, the high number and the low number that you see on the Hill, the low number would be infinitely better than what we have now. The high number would be best, but I think that's the change, is people realize you're going to compete with China. You're not going to be able to do that by nickel and diming a lot of these efforts.
Another big part of that report talked about a new approach to standards, and you've done a lot of work in this area. CSIS has done a lot of work in this area about where we are in the international standards competition. So I'd love to get your take on that, and also how the U.S. can improve its competitive position in that area, and we can talk a little bit more about what the NSC is attempting to do as well.
That would be great. So on the on the second one, there's a reasonable concern about immigration and Chinese espionage. It's reasonable, but some of the measures to counter it weren't thought through entirely. So we make it difficult for people to enter the country, Chinese technologists. And the standards bodies, which are international, just said, okay, so we won't hold any more standards meetings in the US. That's a burden on us, because now we have to fly our people, fewer people go, at a time when you want to be encouraging participation. So that's a relatively easy fix. That's a regulation. Some of it is building the workforce. Workforce is strong, but spending a little more on STEM education to give us the bodies we need to do this. I think those are the most important parts. On the whole, we're holding our own in standards, but there's a really tough issue. And, maybe you and your members have a view. At this point, about 40 years ago, we thought China was going to be a friend, right? And so we let them into all these things in 1990, maybe 2000 might have been the high point when we put them in the WTO. They have never observed their WTO obligations. So we let them into all these groups, and there they are. They're in the standards bodies. Can we have this work if China is a member? And the Europeans will not back us up on this. So it's the Japanese will, the Australians will, the Indians will, but the Europeans will not. So what does a standards process look like when you've got a hostile actor as one of the participants? It really complicates the situation, and it will take us a while to sort that one out.
Well, and one of the other aspects that you've noted is that we're sort of unique in our distinct commercial-led approach to standards bodies, which is again very different than the rest of the world. And you, rather than recommend that we adapt to or adopt that approach, have said that in fact it needs to continue to be commercially led. As I sort of alluded to earlier, we've recently stood up some working groups where we're trying to create more input into those standards bodies and expand the opportunities for collaboration to bring IP into those bodies, and partially to do that around sort of our sweet spot, which is military and commercial dual use cases, which may not arise out of a more commercially minded sort of set of inputs normally. So it's kind of those edge boundary cases that may be a little bit different for the users that we're trying to satisfy on both sides of the civil military fence. But talk a little bit about how you think that can continue to be viable, that commercially led approach, when there's so much more coordination between the commercial and government sectors around the world.
So when you talk to the companies, what they'll tell you is they are afraid of and do not want a DoD-led standards process. So that's a lot of the opposition, is that they don't want, if you think, what is the World Radiological Conference or whatever it is, US government-led companies come along as members of an official delegation. That works, that's ITU, it allocates standards. It's been going along that way for decades. I don't even know when it started. The problem now is that when you look at the sources of innovation and new technology, it's the companies, right? And it's not even always the big companies. So their argument is we don't want a DoD dominated process. Think of this as an auxiliary cost to the DoD acquisitions process, which is a deterrent to many tech companies. And then the source of new ideas is really the private sector anymore. That's where innovation happens.
Well,
finding a better way to coordinate would be good, though. But
it seems like the Senate is looking to the State Department to play a larger role there. Are your concerns about government-led sort of across the executive branch writ large, or is it mostly focused on the Defense Department? What do you think? How do you think that plays out?
No one's ever raised the State Department with me, and they're still staffing up, so they don't have people in the positions. So no one's ever said, "I'm worried about the State Department." No one's ever said State Department, period. And I used to work there, so they're close to my heart. But no, it's DoD, and it's because so much of the spectrum battle is with DoD. And DoD used to lead the technology innovation process, and some years ago that changed. So how do you accommodate that? Is what people are worried about.
Well, I think part of the challenge too is that there is innovation going on in the Defense Department, and I would argue we're involved in a fair amount of that, as we are, in particular in the 5G realm, as we're really, pushing new bounds that haven't been crossed yet in the commercial markets. And the DoD can provide some of those environments to lead the way for commercial applications where we have dual use cases. But I think a lot of that just it gets lost in the noise, or it's somehow the message isn't making it out there. You think and write and interact a lot on the topic of innovation generally. And you've done some recent work on innovation with allies and ways to deepen our collaboration with, in particular, the Five Eyes of the US, UK, Australia, New Zealand, and Canada. What kind of momentum do you see behind that, and how that might influence innovation, the government fostered innovation in the US?
One of the things that comes up, I was just talking about this last night with some people, is there are a lot of DoD activities, but they aren't particularly well coordinated. Mm-hmm. And they don't necessarily follow a coherent strategy, right? And so if you compare them to like the golden age of William Perry, right, it's a different beast. And so that's one of the questions to think about. There's overlap, there's a lot going on, you're right. But there's overlap and there's a lack of coordination. And, the question is, whenever you say coordination to people, they mean they hear you saying control, right?
Right.
So do you want to move to a more coordinated process in DoD that would raise up the profile of some of these activities? That's a tough policy decision. I tend to generally favor a little more coordination, but we also know that if you do it wrong, it kills off new ideas. Mm-hmm. So I think that's the part with DoD is how do we coordinate the many, you have AFWorks and you have DIU and you have a whole range and a lot of others. but they don't really coordinate what they're doing, right?
Mm.
That's not the Five Eyes issue, but maybe you want to react to that first, because that's one I'm thinking about.
Well, I guess I've been thinking lately about the sort of irony of how we still run into, despite all of the technology, we still run into fundamentally being limited by our ability to share information and situational awareness in an effective and efficient way, right? So we've, in theory, got all this technology that lets us do that, and when we still struggle, we haven't quite cracked that nut yet.
That would be a good one to fix. Yeah.
But so can you just say a little bit about how Five Eyes might do more together, and how realistic you think that kind of increased coordination might be, how impactful, and how it actually gets implemented?
So this administration came in with a commitment to some kind of allied approach to innovation and technology. And it's just literally started. I think that you saw some of it come out of the EU summit, some of it's come out of NATO and NATO 2030, the G7 summit with the people there. So there's a couple efforts to define what does cooperation mean. You know, if you think of, there's research, we have pretty good cooperation on research right now. The commercial part is a little tricky, and that's what I think will take time to sort through. And some of your members have probably lived through this movie. It's like, it's okay to do research together, and at the end, when you go ready to make a product, who owns the property, the intellectual property for that product, right? So you've got to sort that one out. And if you can sort out, this is in all the joint projects we've had, it can take a couple of years, right? But I think the goal is that certainly among the Five Eyes, we'll put New Zealand aside for a moment. Certainly among the Five Eyes, there's a sense that we're in a competition, that we need to work together. And that the way to do joint research, the way to do that is through joint research, maybe joint development. So there's a lot more interest in this, but it's just literally started. It's barely 90 days old. We'll see what comes out of it. But a lot of discussion. More than the Five Eyes. The Five Eyes is seen as sort of the anchor tenant, and then you build out whether it's a T20 or a T12 or some other thing. But I think the problem of intellectual property is going to be one of the obstacles, is who owns the IP at the end when you go to commercialize it.
Well, you've been really generous with your time. I want to close with one last question, if I could, about 6 and 7 and G and beyond. And I think you've just started some work related to 6G. It's being mentioned more and more these days. And as people are just starting to get their heads around 5G, many of the sort of the broader public, where do you think we are in the 6G competition, and then what happens after that?
That's a hard one. It's not fair.
I saved the hardest for us.
Yeah, thank you so much. So, a couple of years ago, people would say, don't even say 6G, it's way too early. Nobody's saying that anymore. In fact, people are coming up to me and saying, when are you going to start doing a 6G project? And that's where we're starting. First, we need to think about 5G, though. And the competition in 5G is not the infrastructure, which is what everyone's focused on. Because, if you have Huawei in your infrastructure, you're at risk. Who do you depend on for your supply chain? The competition is, how do you use it? How do you use these new network capabilities to create new services, to change cost structures? And I think 6G will be more of the same. I don't think we'll recognize the world when we get to 6G. I mean, think about the world pre-internet, right? And so we don't even know. I just asked somebody, this was a mistake on my part, because I was one of the people that worked on commercializing the internet. And so I thought, that was like 25 years ago. And I thought, oh, for the 25th anniversary, I'll interview all the people and say, did you expect what we were going to get? I had no clue what was coming. But it turns out what I was actually measuring was not what they thought, but their egos. Because if they had a big ego, they're like, oh, I saw far into the future. It's like, oh, give me a break. In 1996, you knew we were going to have social networks. We don't know what's going to come. So that's what I'm interested in, is how do we create the structure that allows us to innovate and compete in developing the new services that will ride on 5G and 6G. And it's not going to be phones. It's not going to be your laptop. It's going to be devices, smart cars, autonomous vehicles. It's really going to be something that reshapes the economy, reshapes security. And we have to figure out the best way to make sure that I'm not worried, the US has done really well at this. So what are the odds that we'll do well again? Probably a safe bet. But we need to make sure that if there are obstacles, we've gotten them out of the way. And if there are places we need to spend money, we can appropriate as well.
Well, I think to the extent that we can cooperate with you and inform your work, we love the opportunity to do that. And I'm just really grateful to you for joining me today just to talk through, touched on a whole range of issues, lots and lots out there. And I'd commend the CSIS.org website to anyone who found any of these topics of interest, because there's a lot of more information and your reports and deeper thinking there. So please feel free to reach out to either me or to Jim at any point if you have questions. Thanks for watching. Jim, thanks again for joining me.
Thank you.